Carlton is a Scottish scientist, sociologist, who is currently at the MCC here in Budapest on a summit on drug politics, but he also has certain different topics generally about Scotland, so he talked on a broader perspective about the Scottish society. How is Scotland now? How is the Scottish society in generally nowadays?
Well, I think we have a strange situation in Scotland where we have a government in the form of the Scottish Nationalist Party that presents itself as a very liberal, progressive party, but actually has implemented some of the most authoritarian social policies and kind of laws, certainly in Europe. So over the last few years we've seen a shift occur where rights of free speech, academic freedom, the rights of expression have been severely compromised by the SNP government in the implementation of Hate Speech Act. Now the Scottish government are the only government in the world I'm aware of that have the right to enter a Scottish citizen's house and arrest them and charge them for what they say in the privacy of their own home. So I suppose, to answer your question in a very honest and brutal way, I don't think Scottish society is in a very good way at the moment, because we have a very authoritarian government that seems to be obsessed with constraining and removing people's individual freedoms.
How is it possible in the Scottish political system to have in the same time freedom for the country, what is proposed mostly by SNP to have an independent Scotland, and also theoretically very good liberal positions, and in the reality totally counteracting it by certain woke policies, and also in strong connection of these two very different politics. And as we see the other parties, they are quite different, and who could be voted for if someone wants freedom, both on individual level, freedom of speech, free mindset, freedom of press, and in the same time the freedom for the country. How can be possible? Because if we look at the Tories or even Labour, they are rather pro-UK, and Alba is too small party.
Sure.
So Greens are now coalition partner of the current SNP government, so they are cooperating also in these questions. So how is the political spectrum in Scotland?
I think kind of you raised an important contradiction. The way that I would answer that, I would kind of pose the question as, when Scottish nationalists, when the SNP pose the question of Scottish independence, what do they mean by Scottish independence? For me, independence, in the way that Scottish nationalists pose it and understand it, is not freedom of the nation, freedom of a sovereign state. Essentially, it means leaving Britain to rejoin the European Union. That's not freedom. That's surrendering your national sovereignty to a power that you have very little accountability on. So I would question what Scottish nationalists mean by independence. What alternatives are there in Scotland? I think in terms of, and I've written a little bit about this around Brexit in Scotland. There's this idea that that Scotland didn't want Brexit, that it voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, which is the case if you look at the percentages that voted for and against it. But if you dig a little bit deeper and look at kind of the demographics and the sociology of the voting patterns, you'll see that there were some very significant shifts took place in that traditional SNP voters, particularly within poorer communities, voted to leave the European Union. So there are some quite important shifts that have occurred in Scotland that have raised the question about the validity of the claims of nationalists that they stand for freedom. I think Scottish people now understand the threat of the authoritarian threat of the SNP and seek the protection that are offered to them by being part of the UK still. That's not to say that Westminster isn't a problem, because many of the policies that the SNP have implemented, we now have governments in the UK that are trying to do the same thing. And certainly within Scotland, if you look at the established parties, predominantly the pro-union parties, the Tories, the Conservatives and Labour, they offered very little resistance to a number of the authoritarian problematic policies such as the hate crime bill that the SNP have implemented. I think what will happen over the next few years will be very, very interesting. We have seen in the UK, more broadly, the rise of reform under Farage. We're also seeing the growth of support for Farage's Reform Party, populist party in Scotland. They're making very strong headway in local council elections. So in 2026, there will be elections to the Scottish Parliament. I estimate that Reform will do very, very well. So I think there are important shifts occurring in the political makeup and the political sociology of Scotland, where people are beginning to see through the kind of the lies and the ideologies of the mainstream parties, which includes the SNP, and want something new. They want to shake up the system because the system has not worked for them. They want a fresh face, and I think Reform offer that. That's not to say that Reform are the solution to all problems, but I think kind of Reform have become a realistic option for the people in Scotland to actually bring real change to their lives, to see real change in the way that their rights are restored, their freedom of expression are restored, their freedom of speech are restored. So I think we're going to see, certainly over the next couple of years, some quite interesting developments happening at the level of established political parties in Scotland and new voices emerging to represent the Scottish people.
You wrote an interesting study about the education system in Scotland. As of before Brexit, there was a law which exempted Scottish residents and EU citizens from tuition fees at universities, but in the same time people from the other parts of the UK, like England, Wales and Northern Ireland, were obligated to pay such fees. What were the effects of this law on the education system of Scotland?
I think that's a very important question, because the education reforms that the SNP brought in, which were primarily organised around the idea that Scottish students shouldn't pay university fees, that their education would be free. And that's been their kind of flagship policy. What has happened, though, is that it's had the reverse effect, because Scottish universities have undergone protracted periods post-Brexit, but before Brexit as well. This is a tendency that was, so it's not just about Brexit, but what has happened is that Scottish universities are no longer able to compete, and haven't been for some time, with their British counterparts because of the lack of fees that they're allowed to charge, particularly Scottish students. Now, there are some exceptions to that. You have the very elite universities in Scotland, Glasgow University, Edinburgh, St Andrews. These universities are able to attract global, international students who are willing to pay thousands and thousands of pounds a year, or tens of thousands of pounds a year to attend. But what has happened as a consequence of the SNP's no fees policy, it had the direct opposite effect. So what happened was that Scottish universities were forced, because they were getting no money from Scottish students, they were forced to recruit overseas students or fee-paying students. So they restricted the numbers of Scottish students that were allowed to attend Scottish universities. So it penalised Scottish students. So even though the idea was, oh, your education is free for Scottish students at Scottish universities, it undermined the economic capabilities of Scottish universities to compete economically and financially with counterparts not only in England but abroad. And so what happened was they began to restrict the number of places on programmes, on modules. The number of students they were allowed to recruit from Scotland became smaller and smaller and smaller. And we now have a system where Scotland's best students can't get into its best universities because of the kind of the way that the economics now dictate the way that these universities recruit. It's also had the effect, which is really coming to light now, is that Scottish universities are in, the vast majority of them, are in a real funding crisis.
Isn't the state financing it well?
No. So there's a real, the funding crisis really evolves from the non-fee paying students. So there's this contradiction that if you recruit Scottish students, you don't get any money for it, because how the Scottish government funds it, the going rate for what you would get from an English student or from a student from overseas. So what we have now is a real situation where Scottish universities are in real financial crisis. My university, where I work, the University of West Scotland, is undergoing redundancies. It's announcing redundancies, getting rid of staff in order to kind of recoup money. Dundee University is a massive redundancy program going on there. So Scottish universities have not benefited from the no fee or the free education for Scottish students. It's actually had the opposite effect. It's bankrupted many universities, and it's also disadvantaged Scottish students who are excluded from, even the best Scottish students are excluded from the best Scottish universities, because they're able to make more money by recruiting English students or overseas students.
You stated at the panel discussion a few hours ago that Scotland is leading in Europe, or maybe even worldwide, in drug debt. Mm-hmm. What is the reason? What is quite interesting that one of the most famous Scottish movies is Trainspotting, also thematizing this phenomenon already decades ago. How became Scotland as it is now? Well,
Scotland's become, and has been since certainly the late 2000s, 2018 perhaps, if not before, has consistently been the drugs death capital of Europe. The analogy and the comparison with Trainspotting is very, very interesting, because the generation or the cohort that are dying from drug deaths in Scotland are called the Trainspotting generation. They're those individuals, usually men, predominantly men, who grew up in that era of that film and kind of I suppose the analogy is that the film somehow reflected a reality of what Scottish life was like and what Scottish drug culture was like. So there's a kind of idea that Scotland has and there's some basis to this historically, that Scottish culture is a culture that kind of celebrates intoxication, whether it be drugs or drink. Scotland's famous for drink and kind of hogmanay and things like that. However, the analogy with train spotting is interesting at another level, because if you remember the film and the song by Iggy Pop that's played in it, the question that is posed, and I think it's Renton, the lead character, is that you either stay as an addict, ruin your life, or you choose life. And the conclusion to the film is the happy ending. Renton particularly chooses life. Unfortunately, we have drug policies in Scotland at present that don't allow the capacity of individuals who are addicted to drugs to choose life. It treats the addict as an identity that is kind of worth preserving, if that makes sense. That kind of is it's this idea that you're an addict, okay, we'll look after you. We'll provide you with conditions that you can safely consume your drug. We can manage the harm.
It's also some kind of state paternalization.
Yes, but doesn't provide the mechanisms or the route out of addiction. It doesn't provide the facilities. It doesn't provide the funding to take the addict and put them into recovery so they can begin to play a more active, positive role in society as a person rather than an addict. And I think that's where the analogy with train spotting breaks down, because at least in the film they broke out of that dangerous addiction cycle, whereas we now have a policy cycle, as you mentioned quite accurately, a form of state paternalism that traps the addict in this kind of deadly loop where they're not allowed to, or it's not seen as applicable to allow the addict to move into a stage of recovery and then contribute positively to society.
What are your plans for the future? Which topics are you researching now, and what future you see for Scotland? I
think at a personal level, I'm currently writing up and hoping to do more research on the drugs issue. I'm planning a series of articles which I hope will form a book which I'm hoping to try and get published towards the end of this year. So that's my immediate concentration. So I'll be taking many of the ideas that I've discussed at this conference today. The future for Scotland, I think the future for Scotland is very interesting. For what we were talking about earlier, with the kind of the breakdown of the old political parties and the emergence of potentially new parties such as Reform. So I think the future of Scotland could be quite exciting. The outcomes of that, I'm not sure, but it's certainly, I think there's going to be some interesting debates, and there's going to be some interesting developments that are going to happen over the next few years in Scotland politically.
Thanks for this wee insight into this broad topic.
Thank you.